Remember waiting for your favorite TV show to come on or the newest movie to hit Blockbuster so you could rent it? Let's go through some precious memories from the 70s that the adults always looked forward to. Saturday morning cartoons are not really something that people are unfamiliar with even in today's generation, but the long-held ritual has definitely become less relevant over time. A lot of this is because of streaming services and internet websites having every kind of media that a child would want to consume. Also, kids back then did not have social media or YouTube, so these cartoons really were as good as it got for many. If you had leftovers, especially pizza, from a Friday family dinner, then it was the perfect start to a weekend. One reason this became such a widespread tradition is because appointment television was very common. This was due to TV programs having specific timings and slots, like 7 a.m. for Scooby and Scrappy-Doo or 10 a.m. for Jabberjaw. Once you missed the assigned slot for these shows, you had effectively missed an episode, and there was not a way to catch up either. What are some of your favorite shows from the heyday of the 70s? When your usual dose of television was not available, you had Pet Rocks, courtesy of Gary Dahl, a collectible toy line that consisted of these rocks which were packaged in custom cardboard boxes, and they even came with little holes for ventilation. There was straw bedding that was used to imitate a pet carrier, and they became extremely popular. The Pet Rock was first released in 1975, and people would buy them as gifts or joking pranks. They made for pretty cheap gifts too, as you could get them at like $3.95 a piece at most convenience stores. After they got released, they sold 5 million in just 6 months, so it definitely got some traction in the market. As far as toys go, there were a lot more boring things to play with than stone pets you could collect. It made for a pretty humble brag too when you had all the collectibles and your friends came over. Most people's idea of a fun time was watching Star Wars when it came out in theaters. So imagine how much fun it was to be a kid going with your family, getting the largest popcorn and drink along with first-row seats. Star Wars was one of the biggest things about the entire decade of the 70s, considered now to be one of the most big-time franchises ever. When the first one came out, families and singles alike wanted to see what the hype was. A New Hope was an accurate title for the film that would spawn a series which continuously restored people's faith in the blockbuster and cinema experience. When it first came out in 1977, movies suddenly became the hottest thing once again. It also made the producers a literal mountain of gold, as the production was just $11 million, but the profit was $775 million. Kids built a box office record that still is considered one of the most historical ones ever by insisting their parents go to the theaters with them just to catch this movie. Speaking of media that defined a generation, watching The Wonderful World of Disney when it ran from 1969 to 1979 was definitely an experience that people will thoroughly remember long after our time too. The show was just that good, ranking in the top 20s regularly and being one of the most popular Disney projects to date. It was especially popular with children and captivated them as they watched with eyes glued to the screen. The story and premise of the show was very episodic, with a different story being showcased each time. Many of the fan-favorite ones were things like the Disneyland story, the True Life Adventures, and the Man in Space miniseries. Nowadays, you can just search this up on YouTube or get a file downloaded in high quality, but back then, kids would make sure to do all their chores and studying on time so they would not miss a beat of the wonderful world of Disney, and we cannot blame them. We have all heard tunes and carols during the snowy season, but Christmas caroling is largely considered a lost now, with its golden days being in the 70s. Children would rehearse for days on end in church and at home for the perfect synced-up melody that they could spread all over the neighborhoods. This was so common that the activity typically made a cameo in most films that were shot in winter, like some of the Home Alone movies. People really did always expect to see kids caroling famous Christmas songs, and hearing A Silent Night being echoed by various groups of Santa's little elves is a core memory both children who grew up during that time and adults from that era can look back on vividly. It was just that popular of a tradition, and it was pretty safe to send your child out singing with the rest of their friends throughout the neighborhood too. Maybe they would come back with some cookies, eggnog, or a nifty Christmas present, but they would always come with a big fat smile on their face. That little period of childhood when you wholeheartedly believed in visits from the Tooth Fairy was truly another world in retrospect. Sure, all of us would know the truth sooner or later, that there was never any fairy with incredibly personal transport, but only your mom and dad with what they could get you from the store. Sometimes that was a present to really solidify your belief in the generosity of the supernatural, and sometimes it made you think why a fairy would know about the latest Power Ranger action figures. Either way, waking up to a present or some money made the pain of losing your teeth for the first time something to look forward to rather than hate. Kids would always happily start thinking about what they wanted as soon as they felt a tooth shaking, and we think that is an incredible flip on the narrative. An otherwise unpleasant experience turned into a happy childhood memory, all via a lie that we just conveniently agree to keep every generation? Who says people cannot work together? Another festive occasion that always brought out droves of excited kids was the 4th of July, especially with all the fireworks, a custom we still uphold regularly. An entire generation of 70s to 80s kids have fond recollections of going to the store with their parents, picking out the perfect fireworks and setting them off as soon as the clock hit 12 and it was the 4th. With the amount of people who would fire off colorful explosions in the sky, the nighttime was a scene to behold for anyone, and a picture-perfect sight that lots of Americans would not forget even as they grew up. In fact, some of the best family moments happen when kids set off the precious fireworks they spent their entire weekend gathering and revel in the fun of the night. The 4th of July is definitely an occasion where lots of people have days they will not be forgetting. Not just children, but as a child, the fun factor is definitely 10 times more grand. You may have heard a lot about Sunday school and not know exactly what it is, but for those who do know, and even more so, for our viewers who continuously went every weekend, community potlucks were something else. It was not necessary to be a Sunday school student. If you helped out at a church as a kid or had one in your neighborhood, you would experience the joy of a community potluck. These were the closest things to communal kitchens that America ever had, and they involved a community of people sharing all their food resources and having one grand meal. The idea took off pretty fast after the Great Depression from the 30s to 50s, and by the 70s it was an established facet of American culture. In those struggling times, and even in the 70s when the economy had not entirely recovered, people thought it was much more efficient to share their resources and make big meals that could feed entire communities, as individual homes did not have enough to sustain their families more often than not. While it is a habit that has vanished from the American people by now, we would definitely like to see something this festive come back. Listening to the sound of ice cream trucks passing by was not just something you saw in cartoons and commercials. It was a way of passing the evenings and relaxing as a child that almost everyone took part in. Maybe you did not realize just how soothing this was as a kid, when you would always be in a carefree mood, but if you hear them now and your head flashes back to younger days, then you are the kind of person we are referring to. Ice cream trucks would regularly patrol neighborhoods, often taking the same routes each day, making sure they always hit up their top-selling customers. As soon as the sound would make its way into your home, an innocent excitement would bubble up immediately in your heart as you sprang out of bed, clutching the last of your allowance and blowing it all on your favorite soft-serve flavors. Ice cream trucks are not too popular now because you can get everything through Uber Eats. And ice cream bars are more of a trendy thing these days, but no one will forget the importance of the ice cream truck, a way of filling your sweet tooth cravings that pioneered the way for so many other kinds of ice cream-related goodness. Just like the PlayStation 4 and Xbox One laid claim to an entire decade of gaming and cemented themselves as the go-to consoles of the 2010s, the 70s had the Atari 2600. A lot of children will remember playing classics like Pitfall, Battlezone, Solaris, and Asteroids. In 1972, Pong came out, which gave the console a lot of hype and even sold a lot of Ataris. It was kind of like how Sony would put Bloodborne on every PlayStation 4 as a package deal, which genuinely did work in selling hundreds of thousands of consoles. That same marketing scheme worked for the Atari, but beyond convenient combos and an impressive library, The Atari 2600 was a leap in technology that allowed for all kinds of new gaming experiences, especially in the platforming genre. A lot of these were just the kind of dopamine rush that children craved in their day to recover from a sickening morning spent in school cramming fractions and the names of different animal species. They also were great to play with a friend, and some of the most popular games of our time first came out on this console, like the timeless Pac-Man. Yes, that same Pac-Man going down in a line, devouring everything in sight. Today, an Atari 2600 video game or console would be a vintage item, but back then it was a must-have for most middle-class kids. At the very peak of the disco craze that overtook much of the 20th century were the 70s, a time when literally everybody was going out to the disco. It was the precursor to the raves and Coachella festivals of today. One of the ways that people found new experiences in the usual glam of the disco ball as they danced the night away was through roller discos. These were essentially skating rinks where the dancers would wear these flashy, pop-themed disco skates, and most of the music would be disco music. Historically, at least, most of the music selection would be disco-themed or in the same genre, with the occasional dance ballad or pop track put on. Some clubs would even pay rock bands like Lynyrd Skynyrd and Blue Oyster Cult, which is definitely not something you would expect to hear when going out on the town for a night of skating around in flashy lights. This was the way people partied it up in the 70s, and roller discos were popular enough that many artists even relied on them playing their latest releases for promotion. Traditionally, people would wear inline skaters, but one thing that these places were notorious for was how unique everyone's sense of style and fashion was. They resurfaced in the 2000s, but roller discos are sadly mostly a bygone trend of the past now. Today, we have gadgets like iPads and tablets to fulfill our artistic needs, but back then, coloring books was all everyone wanted. Just you, your new coloring book, and some crayons would make every kid's day. Many brands recognized how popular coloring books were becoming and started producing their own variants of the basic coloring book. Major companies like Barbie, Marvel, DC, and even sports teams created books with unshaded characters that children could bring to life with their color pencils and crayons. This was the time when gifting a coloring book to a child was considered hip, not old-fashioned. Alas, like every old trend, coloring books started to lose their cool in front of digital coloring pads and digital art tablets like the iPad, where you have any and all art utensils available to you digitally. Coloring books are still available, but rarely used by children anymore. Drive-in movies were such a big part of the culture of the 70s, and some of the most popular movies in the history of the United States of America first came out as drive-in movies. We are talking about titles like Night Drive, Drive-In, The Texas Chainsaw Massacre, and more. All of these are peak moments of the 70s, and each title on its own sold out theaters across the nation. But what about when you wanted to have a more comforting experience watching a movie but still wanted to go out? Sure, to scratch that kind of itch nowadays, you have things like Netflix and 123 movies, as well as every restaurant in your vicinity on your phone screen. But in the 70s, you had to go to drive-in movies to get this kind of fun. People would enjoy B-movies in massive parking lots with many others, under a romantic open sky on a big screen. However, you might be thinking that this does not really sound like something that would attract lots of kids because it sounds like a setting for young middle-aged adults. That could not be further from the truth, as kids would explicitly beg their parents to skip the cinema and go catch a drive-in movie with their favorite burger. It was a one-of-a-kind experience that we can only look back on now, as drive-in movies are largely forgotten. Neighborhood barbecues were pretty similar to potlucks, in that they gave a sense of community to neighborhoods that we often do not see today. Well, who can blame us either? The real estate market is quite fast, and your neighbors move out faster. Back then, people still got to know their neighbors and threw barbecues that would have the whole block over. Kids would fight over ribs and who would get to work the grill before eventually being distracted by their parents so they could actually get started on some serious grilling. The aroma of smoked meat and the perfect ranch or dressing would cover the entire vicinity, with all of it being a scene right out of the ending of a Fast and Furious movie. It was so common in the 70s and 80s for people to really spend time with their neighbors and let their kids get to know each other too. People who grew up in the 70s might remember how they would play with their neighbors in parks or their backyard, and a big part of building that kind of relationship were these homely barbecues. The Cave of Time, The Journey Under the Sea, Space and Beyond, and your code name is Jonah. Do any of these ring some bells? They were a part of a book series known as Choose Your Own Adventure, and the entire purpose of them was to be interactive books which would let readers pick their own endings. In a way, these books walked so the role-playing genre could run. I guess Dungeons & Dragons lovers have these to thank in some way since they popularized media with strong narratives that still allowed for personal choice to add to the fun. These were a type of book known as game books, and they were specifically aimed at children. Each of the stories were from a second person's point of view, and the reader would be the protagonist of the story. The choices they picked out of what the game book offered them were what decided the eventual ending readers would end up with. These really were the prototype for RPG games, since most video games like that today follow the same blueprint. These game books were a marvel back then and were probably the only instance where you could get a child to enthusiastically interact with a book. They have passed into American history now, but if you remember playing some of these, you know how good they were. It is time to let the curtain fall, just as it did on all of these beloved aspects of the 70s. If you had fun while watching this video, then subscribe and hit the like button.